Some moments in life do not fade. They do not soften with time or lose their edges. Instead, they stay sharp, ready to cut you again the moment you recall them. My name is Marina Cole. I am 37 years old, born and raised in a quiet coastal town in Oregon. And for the past decade, I have been the senior creative director at StratusNova, a tech and design powerhouse that prides itself on sleek products and flawless branding. I have given this company more than my years. I have given it my vision, my late nights, my weekends, my name hidden in every design choice. I thought I understood loyalty. I thought I knew the rules of the game. That illusion shattered on a Friday afternoon in a glass boardroom high above the city. It was our quarterly review, a meeting I had prepared for meticulously, with the kind of presentation that usually left the board impressed and quiet. The room was cold with that polished corporate air, and sunlight hit the polished glass table like a spotlight on every face. Grady, our new CEO, sat at the head of the table. A man who had been with us for barely 3 months yet, carried himself like he had built the company brick by brick. He had a smile that never reached his eyes and a tendency to perform his authority as though he were playing to an invisible crowd. When it came to my turn, I stood with my slides ready, knowing that the rebranding projections we had prepared would secure our next 3 product launches. Ethan did not even let me begin. He leaned back in his chair, waved a hand, and said, "We are not doing any of that. Design is decorative. It is not strategic." His words landed like a slap, casual yet cutting. I froze, unsure whether to argue or let him finish. Then, in a move that would burn itself into my memory forever, he reached for a document from the folder in front of him. My equity contract, the one I had signed 5 years earlier after earning it through 2 major product successes. Without even glancing at me, he held it up, looked around the room, and tore it into 4 slow, deliberate pieces. The sound was deafening in the silence. Paper tearing has a strange finality to it, especially when it is worth more than most people's homes. He tossed the pieces into the trash bin beside him, as though discarding nothing more than an old receipt. The room stayed silent. I felt every eye on me, some full of pity, others carefully blank, the way people look when they want no part of someone else's downfall. My face burned hot, but my hands stayed perfectly still. Inside, there was a rush of humiliation and anger so strong I could almost hear my pulse in my ears. I wanted to stand up, to tell him he had just made the most foolish move of his short reign. But I did not. I swallowed every word, because in that moment I remembered something he did not know, a detail from long before he ever stepped foot in this building. Ethan continued speaking as if nothing had happened, moving on to the next agenda item, talking about streamlining costs and restructuring priorities. My slides sat unopened on the table in front of me. I looked at them and thought about the irony. He called my work decorative, yet my designs were in every product box, every marketing campaign, every interface the company had ever launched under my leadership. He thought that tearing up that contract erased my value. What he did not understand was that my value was not printed on that paper. It was embedded into the very identity of StratusNova, and that identity belonged to me in ways he could not yet imagine. As the meeting dragged on, I kept my expression neutral, nodding at points, taking notes as though his actions had not pierced through my career like a blade. But underneath that calm was a slow, deliberate burn. I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Ethan thought he had humiliated me. He thought the show of tearing my contract in front of the board would prove his power and diminish mine. What he had done instead was trigger a chain of events that would unravel his position thread by thread. When the meeting ended, people filed out without meeting my eyes. I stayed behind for a moment, pretending to gather my papers. Ethan glanced at me briefly, almost amused, as if waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. I walked out with my back straight, the way my father once told me to when dealing with people who confuse cruelty for strength. I knew something he did not. I knew the clock had just started ticking, and when it reached 0, he would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate me. Because what he destroyed in that room was not my contract. It was his own safety net. And soon, the man who thought design was decorative would learn that it could also be a weapon. A weapon I had been sharpening for years, waiting for the right moment to use. And thanks to him, that moment had just arrived. I did not go straight home after that meeting. Instead, I walked 3 blocks to a quiet cafe I had visited often during my early years at StratusNova, back when we were still crammed into a single floor of a rented warehouse, and the idea of a boardroom felt almost ridiculous. The place had not changed much. Warm lighting, chipped wooden tables, the faint smell of espresso. I ordered a black coffee, sat in the corner booth, and opened my laptop. My hands were steady now. The heat of humiliation had cooled into something sharper, cleaner, calculation. Ethan Grady had just shredded my contract in front of the board, but he had not erased the part of me that always planned for storms before they broke. I pulled up a folder I had not opened in years, labeled simply contingency. Inside was the document I had written and fought for back in 2015 when the company was still gasping for funding and no one expected the design team to have leverage. Clause 9b, Originator's Identity Rights. I had drafted it myself after a late-night conversation with Graham Voss from Legal, who had warned me never to assume that hard work alone would protect me. The clause was short, only a paragraph, but it was precise. It stated that any brand identity, naming structure, proprietary design system, or creative asset I originated while employed at StratusNova would remain my intellectual property unless otherwise negotiated in writing. Not the company's, mine. And it went further. Those assets were registered under my own LLC, which I quietly formed that same year. Every logo, every font pairing, every micro-interaction coded into the user experience, filed, recorded, and renewed annually under my name. Back then, the executives had barely looked at the clause before signing. They needed me to rebrand our flagship product for an investor pitch, and I delivered results that tripled pre-orders. I remembered how the COO at the time had chuckled, saying, "Sure, Marina, whatever you need. Let us just close this deal." They thought it was harmless legal padding. I knew it was an insurance policy, one I might never need but would always keep. Now, sitting in that cafe years later, I could see just how valuable that insurance had become. Ethan's so-called rebrand was already leaning heavily on my original frameworks. I had seen the mock-ups during the meeting. They had lifted color codes, design templates, and structural systems directly from my work, likely without even realizing those were under separate ownership. If they pushed forward without negotiating rights, they would not just be redesigning, they would be trespassing. I sipped my coffee and stared out at the rainy street, remembering the look in Ethan's eyes when he tore that paper. It was the look of someone who believed the past could be erased with a gesture. He had no idea that I had planted seeds in that past, small deliberate details that would grow into walls he could not climb. I did not need to confront him yet, not when I could let his own momentum carry him straight into the trap he had built for himself. I closed the laptop, feeling the first flicker of satisfaction since the meeting. My humiliation had been public, yes, but my revenge would be silent until it was irreversible. Clause 9b was more than a legal safeguard. It was a quiet line of ownership running through the company's very identity, and Ethan had just stepped on it without looking down. By the time I left the cafe, the rain had stopped and the streets shone with reflected light. I walked back toward my apartment with a calm so deep it surprised me. The board thought they had watched a CEO assert control today. What they had actually witnessed was the first act in a much longer play, one I had been writing for years and one I intended to finish on my terms. Ethan had made his move. Now it was my turn to wait for the perfect moment to make mine. Ethan wasted no time putting his mark on the company. By Monday morning, my inbox was flooded with forwarded memos and meeting invites titled Project Clean Slate, his pet name for the rebrand. It was a rollout that bypassed every layer of the process we had built over the years. No creative brief, no brand audit. Just a series of directives from his office that read like a wish list, written by someone who had never built anything from the ground up. He spoke in slogans, not strategy, and the people around him were too wary or too ambitious to point that out. The official announcement came during the all-hands meeting. The auditorium was packed, employees shoulder to shoulder, murmuring over the new logo displayed on the massive screen behind him. It was a flat, soulless thing, stripped of the personality that had taken years to develop. The color palette looked like it had been picked in a hurry from a free online generator. Ethan stood at the podium, smiling like a man revealing a masterpiece, and talked about shedding old skin and becoming a cleaner, leaner, modern entity. I watched faces in the crowd, confusion from the veterans, polite enthusiasm from the newer hires who did not know better. I sat in the second row, silent. My department had not been consulted. The work they were showcasing as the foundation of the new identity was built on my original frameworks, the same structures protected under Clause 9b. I could see my influence in every corner of it, right down to the spacing and the typography. It was like watching someone repaint your house without permission, using your own brushes and then claiming they built it themselves. Ethan talked for nearly 40 minutes, weaving in promises about market growth and branding alignment with upcoming product launches. He never once acknowledged the team that had built the brand he was now erasing. In fact, he barely acknowledged the concept of a design department at all. To him, this was not about evolution, it was about personal credit. He wanted the board, the investors, the press to see a transformation and believe it was all his doing. I kept my expression neutral, nodding in the right places, but inside, I was already charting the ways his plan would collapse. A rebrand is not just a new logo. It is an ecosystem, a network of systems, language and visuals that must work together or fall apart. Ethan had taken the skeleton of mine and stripped away the muscles and connective tissue. Without those, the whole thing would fail under its own weight. And when it did, I would be standing exactly where I needed to be. After the meeting, people gathered in clusters, whispering about the new look. Some tried to convince themselves it would grow on them. Others avoided saying anything at all, the way people do when they sense trouble but cannot name it. I walked back to my office, aware of the strange calm settling over me again. Ethan thought this was the beginning of his legacy. I knew it was the beginning of his undoing. He had just pulled the thread on a sweater he did not knit, and I was more than willing to let him keep tugging until the whole thing unraveled. It did not take long for the cracks to show. Within 2 weeks of Ethan's grand unveiling, the first complaints began slipping into the customer service queue. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Confusion over the new logo, frustration from longtime clients who could no longer recognize the product packaging on shelves. But then the reports became harder to ignore. Customers were calling to say the app felt clunky and off-brand. Partners were flagging mismatched visuals and joint campaigns, and social media was filling with side-by-side comparisons of the old design versus the new. The old was winning, by a landslide. I heard snippets in the hallways, engineers grumbling about integration issues, marketing teams quietly fuming that they had lost years of brand equity overnight. The new interface did not follow the flow customers had grown comfortable with. Pages loaded slower. Fonts broke in certain languages. Even the smallest inconsistencies began stacking into a wall of frustration. Ethan, of course, insisted these were teething pains, the inevitable hiccups of bold change. But I knew better. What he called hiccups were symptoms. Symptoms of ripping out the foundation and thinking the walls would still stand. From my quiet vantage point, I could see the pattern unfolding. The design systems Ethan's team had cobbled together were fragile because they were built without the underlying architecture, my architecture, that kept every visual, every interaction, every message aligned. Without the logic of the original framework, the brand's identity was like a body with its spine removed. It could stand for a moment, maybe even move, but it would collapse under the weight of daily use. I will admit, there was a part of me that took a certain grim satisfaction in watching it happen. Not because I wanted the company to fail, I had invested too much of myself in it to wish for that, but because it confirmed what I had always known. Good design is invisible until it is gone. Ethan had called my work decorative, but now that it had been stripped away, everyone could see the holes it left behind. By the third week, even the sales teams were complaining. Clients were hesitant to sign renewals. Long-term partners wanted to know why the company looked like a cheap knockoff of itself. Internally, the mood was shifting. People who had nodded along during Ethan's speeches were beginning to question his vision, though few dared to say it out loud. I watched it all quietly, the same way you might watch a tide come in. Slow at first, then faster, inevitable, unstoppable. And through it all, Clause 9b sat like a silent time bomb in my possession. Every broken element of the new brand had its roots tangled in my original protected assets. Every glitch was a breadcrumb, leading straight back to the work Ethan thought he had erased. He just had not realized yet that the cracks in his rebrand were not just mistakes. They were legal tripwires, and sooner or later he was going to step on one. The first real hit came on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through my coffee when my phone buzzed with a message from Graham Voss in legal. Graham is not the kind of man who wastes words, so when I saw his text, "Call me now," I knew something had gone wrong. I closed my office door, dialed his number, and he answered on the first ring. "Marina, we have a problem," he said, his voice carrying that careful mix of urgency and restraint lawyers use when they know their line might be recorded. Graham explained that our compliance systems had begun flagging the new branding assets, logos, layouts, typefaces, as intellectual property owned by my LLC. At first, the automated warnings were brushed off as software errors, but overnight, several of those assets had been reported by third-party platforms as copyright violations. App stores were holding updates for review. An advertising partner had paused a digital campaign until ownership concerns were resolved. In plain terms, the company could not fully operate until the issue was cleared, and the issue was me. I listened without interrupting, letting him walk me through the chain reaction. The takedown notices had been triggered by the same legal registrations I had been quietly renewing every year since 2015. They were airtight, documented, time-stamped. Every asset Ethan's team had used was tied to my original protected work. Without a proper licensing agreement from me, they were essentially trespassing on private property. And now the systems designed to protect creators were doing their job. Ethan's office must have been in chaos. Graham told me he had already sat in 2 emergency calls with the executive team that morning, during which Ethan dismissed the problem as overblown and accused compliance of being too rigid. But the reality was unavoidable. Our flagship app was locked in the review stage on 2 major platforms. The company's biggest e-commerce partner had sent a formal notice requesting proof of brand rights before they would ship the next batch of products, and web hosts had issued warnings that entire sections of our site could be disabled if ownership disputes were not resolved within 48 hours. I could almost picture it. Ethan pacing in his office, voice raised, hands slicing the air as he demanded someone just fix it. But there was no quick fix for this. The walls he had torn down to build his clean slate were the same ones holding up the roof, and now the rain was coming in fast. He had not only underestimated me, he had underestimated the infrastructure that protected my work. I thanked Graham for the call, told him to keep me updated, and hung up. Then I leaned back in my chair and let the silence of my office settle around me. This was not about revenge for the sake of revenge. This was about balance, about the quiet satisfaction of watching arrogance meet its own consequences. Ethan thought design was decoration. Now he was learning that it was also the skeleton of everything he had touched. And without that skeleton, his grand vision was starting to crumble, one legal notice at a time. By Thursday morning, the collapse was no longer just a threat. It was in full view. The first thing I saw when I opened my laptop was an internal alert from IT. App temporarily unavailable on primary app stores. Access suspended pending resolution of intellectual property claims. 2 minutes later, another notification popped up, this one from the web team. The company's homepage had been replaced with a compliance placeholder. The sleek, carefully designed portal that once greeted millions of visitors was now a sterile white page with a single line of text. This content has been removed due to unresolved ownership disputes. The ripple effects hit fast. Our customer service lines lit up with complaints from confused users who could not log in or update their software. Retail partners started halting shipments, unwilling to stock a product with a disputed identity. Even the corporate social media accounts were frozen, their handles temporarily locked while platform moderators investigated the claims tied to the new branding. It was as though the entire public face of StratusNova had gone dark overnight. I imagined the boardroom that morning, the blinds drawn, voices raised, phones buzzing with investor demands for answers. I pictured Ethan at the head of the table, jaw tight, searching for someone to blame. But there was no scapegoat this time. The cause was clear, documented, and entirely self-inflicted. He had built his rebrand on the bones of my work without securing the rights to use it. And now the architecture was striking back. It is a strange thing, watching a company you helped build teeter on the edge of collapse. Part of me ached for the employees caught in the crossfire, the engineers, the marketers, the assistants pulling double shifts to patch holes they had not created. But another part of me could not ignore the poetic symmetry of it all. Ethan had stood in front of the board and torn up my contract as though it meant nothing. Now the company's future was being shredded, piece by piece, by the very assets he had dismissed as decorative. By midday, the atmosphere in the office had shifted completely. Hallways were hushed, meetings were canceled, and clusters of employees spoke in low tones behind closed doors. Even the most loyal of Ethan's supporters seemed to sense that the tide had turned. You could feel it in the way people avoided his gaze, in the way they cleared out of a room when he entered. I stayed in my office, quietly watching the updates roll in. I did not need to lift a finger. The systems I had put in place years ago were doing the work for me. Ethan had walked straight into a maze with walls I had built, and now he was discovering there was no easy way out. The lights were going out one by one, and when the last one went dark, he would finally understand just how costly it is to underestimate the person who designed the very foundation under your feet. The call came on a Sunday evening, which told me everything I needed to know before I even answered. Executives never break into their weekends unless the walls are truly closing in. The number flashing on my phone was one I had not seen since before Ethan arrived. Cynthia Harlow, chairwoman of the board. I let it ring twice, just long enough to remind myself that I was in control, and then I picked up. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fatigue behind it. "Marina, we need to talk." It was the kind of tone people use when they are about to ask for something they would rather not admit they need. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill it. "We cannot operate without your assets. The websites are down. The app is gone from 3 major platforms. Our partners are threatening to pull out of upcoming launches. We need your help." There it was, the acknowledgement Ethan had been avoiding. My work was not decorative, and now they could not function without it. I kept my voice calm, almost soft, as I asked, "Where is Ethan?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying, "He is not on this call," which was another way of telling me that he was no longer the one in charge of fixing the disaster he had created. I thought about the day in the boardroom, about the sound of paper tearing and the smirk on Ethan's face as he tossed my contract into the trash. This was the moment that smirk had been leading to, and I was not going to waste it. "Cynthia," I said evenly, "you know my position. Those assets are mine. If you want them back in play, there will need to be an agreement, one that makes up for what I lost and ensures I will never be put in that position again." She exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing through the line. "I understand. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I almost smiled. They had spent weeks brushing me aside, and now they were calling me in like a firefighter to a building they had set ablaze. "I will be there," I said, "but bring the board. This is not a side conversation. This is the conversation." When I hung up, I sat for a long moment in the quiet of my apartment, the city lights flickering through the window. They thought they were calling me back to solve a problem. What they did not realize was that they were walking into my terms, my timing, my rules. Ethan had started this game, I was going to finish it, and by the time I was done, there would be no doubt left about who really held the keys to StratusNova's identity. The next morning, I walked into the glass boardroom with the same calm I had worn the day Ethan tore my contract. Only this time, I was not there to present or defend anything. I was there to dictate terms. The entire board was present, seated in a perfect semicircle, their faces a mix of tension and forced politeness. Cynthia Harlow greeted me with a nod, but the warmth she once had was gone, replaced by the cool calculation of someone weighing costs against consequences. Ethan's chair at the head of the table sat empty, and I noticed it had been pushed back slightly, as if no one dared to fill it. I placed a single black folder on the table and slid it forward so everyone could see the bold title stamped across the cover: Brand Identity Restoration and Licensing Agreement. Inside were my conditions, laid out with the same precision I once used to design their brand systems. The first page was simple: bullet points, no fluff, no wiggle room. A $4.5 million licensing fee payable immediately. Retroactive compensation for the equity Ethan had shredded in front of them. A permanent licensing contract with automatic renewals at triple my previous salary. Ethan's immediate removal from all leadership roles. And perhaps, most importantly, a clause forbidding any attempt to silence me about this ordeal. No NDAs, no buried legal language, nothing to stop me from telling the story exactly as it happened. Cynthia flipped through the pages slowly, her expression unreadable. The others followed suit, some skimming, others reading line by line. I could see the flickers of resistance, the small shake of a head, the narrowed eyes. But I also saw the reality settling in. They had no leverage. Without my assets, their operations remained paralyzed. Every passing day meant lost revenue, angry partners, and investors losing faith. This was not a negotiation. It was a rescue on my terms. One board member, a man whose name I barely remembered, tried to speak. "These numbers are ambitious," he said. I met his eyes without blinking. "So is rebuilding your brand from scratch after you alienated your customer base and crippled your infrastructure. You came to me because you know the alternative costs more." His mouth closed and he sat back. No one mentioned Ethan by name, but his absence spoke louder than any accusation. He was the author of this crisis, and now his signature move, public humiliation, was coming back to haunt him in the form of my neatly typed bullet points. I had no interest in gloating. I only cared about securing every condition before lifting a finger to restore what they had broken. When I finished outlining the agreement, I leaned back in my chair. "You have 24 hours, I said. After that, I start reaching out to other buyers for my assets, and I will not be coming back to this table." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. I could feel the shift in power, the moment they realized that the woman they had allowed Ethan to cast aside was now the one holding the entire company in her hands. I stood, gathered my things, and left the folder in the center of the table. They would sign it. Of that I had no doubt. Because at the end of the day, it was not just their brand at stake, it was their survival. And I had made sure they understood exactly what that was worth. The board's answer came sooner than I expected. Less than 12 hours after I left the glass boardroom, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Cynthia. "We accept your terms. Please prepare for transition." There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just the kind of terse compliance that comes when people have run out of options. I read it twice, then once more for the satisfaction of letting it sink in. They had folded completely. When I arrived the next morning, the atmosphere in the building felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm finally breaks. The receptionist avoided my eyes. Conversations in the lobby hushed as I passed. The elevator ride up to the top floor was silent except for the faint hum of the cables, the weight of what was about to happen pressing on everyone's shoulders. In the boardroom, the folder I had left yesterday sat open in the center of the table, its pages marked with sticky notes and signatures. Every condition was initialed, every demand met. Ethan's name had been removed from the leadership roster in the internal directory. His office, visible through the glass across the hall, was stripped bare, the blinds drawn shut. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last-minute plea. The man who had tried to erase me was now the one erased, his exit handled with the same cold efficiency he had once used on me. I kept my expression neutral as Cynthia slid the signed agreement across the table. "We are ready to proceed," she said, her voice low, almost careful. I scanned the signatures without rushing, letting the moment stretch. This was not just about money or even about control. This was about balance, restoring what had been taken, and making it clear that what I built could never again be treated as disposable. Once the documents were in my bag, I handed over a single flash drive. "This will restore your brand systems," I said. "The passwords are temporary. In 90 days, they will expire unless the renewal terms are met." The room was silent as I spoke, the weight of my leverage hanging over them like a drawn curtain. They knew I could pull it shut at any time. As I left, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. Steady posture, unhurried stride. This was not the walk of someone returning to an old job. This was the walk of someone stepping into a position of power on her own terms. I was no longer an employee. I was a licensor, a partner on paper, but in reality, the architect of their survival. They had made their choice, and in doing so, they had given me exactly what I wanted. Not just restitution, but a permanent reminder etched into the structure of their company that without me, the lights go out. And now they would live with that truth every single day. I never returned to StratusNova as an employee. The moment my licensing agreement took effect, my role shifted from being part of the machine to owning the tools that kept it running. I worked from my own office across the city, the view overlooking the waterfront instead of a boardroom wall. The irony was not lost on me. Ethan had once told me that design was decorative, and now they were paying me 3 times my former salary for the privilege of using every element I had created. The restoration process was swift. Within a week of my terms being signed, the websites came back online, the app reappeared in the stores, and product shipments resumed. Customers celebrated the return of the brand they recognized, unaware of the quiet war that had just been fought behind the scenes. The board was quick to issue vague statements about corrective measures and brand continuity, careful not to mention the woman who had single-handedly brought the company back from the edge. That was fine by me. I had made sure my revenge did not require headlines to be felt. Before delivering the restored systems, I added one final touch, a subtle renaming of the internal brand asset library. It was now labeled Redundant TM. Every time someone in the company logged in, those letters would appear in bold at the top of their screen, a quiet echo of the moment Ethan decided I was expendable. They would see it during every project, every update, every attempt to innovate without thinking of the foundation beneath. It was my reminder to them, and to myself, that removing the wrong person can cost you everything. As for Ethan, I never saw him again. His departure was handled quietly, but whispers made their way back to me about strained interviews, failed attempts to consult for other companies, and an industry that remembered him not for vision, but for a spectacular miscalculation, the kind that ruins reputations permanently. I did not need to seek him out. The world had already delivered the consequences he had earned. Over time, my life settled into something quieter but sharper. I chose my projects carefully, licensing my work only on contracts that gave me full protection and absolute clarity. I no longer worried about loyalty in business. I had learned that the truest loyalty is to your own value. And though I never once tried to sabotage StratusNova again, the power dynamic had been rewritten in a way that could never be undone. They knew without question that their brand existed at my discretion. Sometimes late at night, I would think back to that Friday afternoon in the boardroom, the sound of paper tearing, the heat in my face, the smugness in Ethan's voice. It was a moment meant to diminish me, but it had become the catalyst for the most decisive move of my career. I had turned humiliation into leverage and leverage into freedom. And that, I realized, was the sweetest form of revenge. Not shouting, not gloating, simply walking away with everything that mattered, while they were left with the knowledge that the keys to their kingdom had always been in my hands.